Hey guys, Logan here with Westerman Woodworking. Super excited. This is my first full-length YouTube video that I'm uploading. And what I'm doing is I'm building a table base for my dining room table. My dining room table I built about 5 or 6 years ago. It was just a big live edge red oak slab. I got it from the lumber mill, and with very minimal knowledge or know-how, very limited tools, I ended up getting it flattened and finished. And then I decided to slap on some Amazon table legs, metal table legs, which were fine. It kind of got the job done. Table is a little wobbly, and my family grew. I have a family of six, and trying to get six dining room chairs around the table is a little cumbersome. So I decided I have some downtime that it's time for me to make a table base. So let me show you what I did.
To get this project started, the first thing I did was cut my pieces down to rough size, but small enough to manage. I didn't film that part, so the first thing I did was plane down my lumber. Once I got everything milled down, I took one of the blanks over to my work table and started drawing out, using a pencil, measuring tape, and a straight edge, a rough leg shape. This isn't going to be the final size, this just give me a visual and idea of what I want my leg to actually be. Once I had the general idea, I got my Rockler tapering jig out and set my angle. Once I had my angle set, I attached my workpiece. I took it over to my table saw and ripped the board down, leaving 2 pieces with correct angle. I did this twice, giving me 4 boards with correct angles. I then took the angle side and reattached it to the jig. I took the board back over to the table saw and ripped a straight edge on the opposite side. This gave me 4 identical legs with the correct shape I was looking for. After all that legwork, it was time to stretch. I took my longer boards and ripped them down to make my stretcher pieces. I did rip them a little wide, and you'll see why here in just a few minutes. Now for the tricky part, figuring out the angle for the legs. I laid the legs and the stretcher on the work table and started moving them around to try to get an idea of what I wanted them to look like. I decided that I wanted the legs splayed at a 7-degree angle, so I took them over to the miter saw and cut that angle on one of the legs. Once the angle was cut, I took my leg back over to my stretcher and make sure I really liked the way it looked. I then decided to take my stretcher pieces over to the miter saw and cut them at a 45-degree angle. I then took the leg piece with a 7-degree cut and butted it up against the stretcher to transfer the line over onto the leg. That way I could figure out what angle I needed my miter saw at to cut. After I made the cut, I took my leg piece back over to my stretcher and made sure everything lined up the way I wanted it. I then cut the remaining 3 legs to match. After cutting the remaining 3 leg pieces, I brought them back over to the stretcher and figured out how much I needed to take off the stretcher to get that seam to line up perfectly. It was a little less than half an inch, so I just made a quick rip using the table saw. As you can see, everything lines up perfectly and I have a nice clean joint. After all that math and playing with angles, I decided I needed something less taxing on the brain and worked on the cross braces. I first took them over to the miter saw and got the ends nice and square. Once I got the ends nice and square, I took it over to the table saw and ripped down the board. This gave me 4 equal cross braces. It was was getting late, but wanted to get the glue up started on the legs. I didn't have a good way of clamping them up, but I remembered a trick I saw on YouTube, using plywood scraps to make clamping blocks and attaching them with CA glue. After a few moments using the activator, the CA glue was dried and I was ready for glue up. Using a little bit of tight volume 2, my handy dandy glue spreader, a couple 6-inch clamps, and some persuasion, I was able to get the legs glued up to the stretcher. Look at those crispy seams. I then had the privilege of doing it 3 more times. After letting everything dry for a few hours, I came back out and carefully with a chisel knocked off the blocks. I came back with the random orbital sander and sanded off any of the remaining plywood or glue that was left over. This took about 45 seconds of legs, but the outcome was perfect. The next day I came out and rounded over all the edges, except for the very top, where the base meets the tabletop.
Alright guys, so I was trying to find a way to connect my cross members to my stretcher. So unfortunately I didn't put it on camera, but I made a couple little jigs. I'm going to show you how they work. Alright, so what these jigs are going to allow me to do is, first one here, I'll be able to take my cross member, place this on here, get it lined up across the top like so, drill a few holes for the dowels, and then with the other one, I can put it on the stretcher and drill a hole here and here, and they should line up perfectly to connect.
Using my freshly created jig and my foot clamps, I drilled holes into all the cross members. Each cross member needed 4 holes. There's 4 cross members, so I drilled 16 holes in total. Once the holes were drilled, I took the cross members over to my stretcher and laid them out and measured out exactly where I wanted everything to be placed. I then took the other half of my jig and placed it on the stretcher where I marked where I wanted my holes to be and drilled those out. I was very careful not to drill all the way through. That's why you see the piece of blue tape on the drill bit. That tells me when I need to stop drilling. After each hole, I got some dowels and did a dry fit just to make sure everything was lining up perfectly. I went through this process a total of 8 times to make sure everything was perfect. Back at the miter saw, I cut some dowels into 3-inch pieces and I inserted them into the stretcher. I was trying to do a dry run, and at this point my table legs were not the same length, and that it ended up causing me some issues, making the angles really tight, and so I was having some challenges getting the cross members to line up. I ended up flipping the base over, and that really helped. Still took a little bit of persuasion, but I got it all together. I'm not sure if this was 100% necessary, but I ended up taking my drill and drilling out some holes about 5.5 inches deep. And then I went ahead and I glued in some dowels. This was just, in my mind, to add a little bit of support and help prevent any flex in the legs at the joint. Using my flush trim saw, I cut the dowels off, and then came back with the sander to make everything nice and smooth up top. After all that, I disassembled my leg assembly and took the cross members back over to my workbench. I ended up measuring about 4 inches in from each side. These are for the holes for the screws that attach my base to my tabletop. And now with my drill, I'm drilling out the holes for the screws. Now for every woodworker's favorite pastime, sanding. Before sanding the table legs, I wanted to get them all cut to the right length. So I measured everything to 28 inches and got my shop assistant daughter to come out and help me. I wanted to make sure I kept everything flush against the fence. That way I got a nice even cut on both of the legs. I then quickly rounded a small roundover on the bottom of each leg, and then I went back to sanding. I sanded the legs all the way up to 120. Once I did that, I came back in with some wood putty to fill in any of the gaps. Once the wood putty was dry, I came back and hand sanded everything with 180 one last time. Next, I decided I wanted to glue in the dowels into my crossmember pieces. After the crossmembers were dry, I decided it's time to assemble the table base. So very carefully, I inserted and glued in each crossmember into the table base. This was quite a workout getting everything together. As you can see, I took off the coat. Took me about 10 minutes. Glue ups are stressful. With enough clamps and persuasion, though, we made it through. The next day, I came out and took off the clamps, and then got to do my favorite thing, and sand away any sleeves out and make sure everything was nice and smooth before finishing. The next thing I did was lay down some trash bags and grab some Minwax True Black and started staining with a foam brush. This took about 15-20 minutes to do the whole table base. After wiping off the remaining stain, we hated it. So back to sanding. Gotta love it. I was a little frustrated with the stain, so to give myself a break, I brought the tabletop out and flipped the base over onto it. Here I'm measuring to make sure that the table base is square onto the tabletop. It is a live edge table, so there's no real square, but I got it as close as I could. Then with the drill, I used it to mark out where my threaded inserts were going to need to be. Using the Miles Craft portable drill guide, I drilled out the holes for my threaded inserts. I used the blue tape once again to know when to stop. Using an Allen key, I inserted the threaded inserts into the tabletop.
Alright, as you guys saw, I sanded the table base. I didn't like the color. I used Minwax True Black, and with the red oak, it just didn't really take the black color. It ended up being more of a walnut or chestnut color. So after doing some research, I found out that I could use some India ink. So I picked up some Speedball Super Black Indian ink from Amazon. Took a couple days to get in. That's why you saw me put in the inserts as I was waiting. But I went ahead and applied it. I applied it just like stain. This is the first coat. I will probably do a second coat, just because in some places it didn't get into all the grain, so there's some blotchiness to it. So I'll probably apply a second coat before I do a top coat. And this is what it looks like after the first coat. I'm going to give it about an hour or so to let it dry before I do the second coat. Not sure if you can tell the difference, but this is after coat number 2.
Once the ink was dry, I grabbed some polyacrylic and a brush and applied 4 to 5 coats to finish off the table base. Here's how the table base turned out. And here are the final results. Tell me what you think.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you have any tips, tricks, what I can do better, please let me know in the comments. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to watch. Until next time, peace.